And once again, this is the lecture on the basics of Columbia River Plateau aquifers. And let's just one more time look at our size of what we're talking about. Remember that we're over here on the east side of a large, very large area of the Columbia River Plateau, most of which was covered by basalts 16 million years ago. The important part to kind of keep in mind is that, again, Moscow-Poland Basin is kind of unique in the fact that it has a fairly thick sequence of basalts and sediments that were in place against the high elevation rocks. And in fact, if you go around the basin, having high elevation rocks even today, about 3,000 feet above the uppermost basalt in Moscow-Poland Basin, that's relatively unique, particularly in the fact that the basin is partly surrounded by older impermeable basement rocks. The other thing that makes it unique is, in order to understand its hydrology, its how the waters are moving through the rocks, you have to look at studies from other places in the Columbia Basin. They have much larger areas, but they in fact may only need to understand one of the basics in order to understand how their water is responding. There's thousands of reports on the groundwater throughout the Columbia Plateau, since nearly everybody, every city, farm, individual house depends on water from the Columbia River basalts and sediments. So how do we understand what the basics are? What I did was read summary articles that were summarizing those reports and come up with what people call either the rule of thumb or the basics, whatever word you want to use. If you want to get into those references and follow some of those and get more studying them in depth, I would suggest that you look up Flonagy's thesis, University of Idaho. Most of that thesis is about compartmentalization and of the lower aquifer system. But he has a good little section in there with great illustrations about what he calls the basics and what I'm calling the basics. And he has also the same references that I used. I would say the only thing you'd be missing is that I'm going to talk about the role of sediments. He did not talk about that much, but what I'm giving you is material that is summarized from other reports throughout the Columbia River Basin, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of how they are important in the Moscow-Poland area. So we're going to cover basalt flow centers, interflow zones, the role of sediments. I will try not to get too carried away with that. That's my little cross to carry. I think the role of sediments has been overlooked. Thin flows and pinch outs. Just a comment or two about depth controls. And we're going to introduce structural controls, which is the topic for the next lecture. So let's take a look, let's take a look at the individual basalt flow. Now I've drawn one here with just a pen and put some blue in where you might encounter some water. Let's look at it as one flow. We know that there's 25 or more of those in the Moscow-Poland Basin, but let's look how one flow responds. And this is a rule of thumb used all over the Columbia River Basin. Let's just start off with a flow. Let's assume this is about 100 feet thick. And if you were to drill through this flow, you would, at the top, you would hit a lot of fractures, and your drill rig, your drill bit will be bouncing around a little bit. And then you would hit a center with very dense, very steady drilling until you got down towards the bottom again. Sort of the drillers refer to it as a breakout, because once again, your drill bit will be bouncing around. There's a lot of fractures in the bottom of most flows. And so where you generally encounter the most water is on the flow bottom and the flow top. Interesting enough, and I think Steve Rydell was the first one to throw out a number, even though as you drive around southeastern Washington or down into Lewiston, what you're generally seeing is these centers. You'll see lots of configurations, lots of columnar type configuration, all the way ranging from small irregular ones that I've attempted to illustrate here to ones like up at the Spokane airport, 6 and 8 feet apart, look like they've been cut by a saw. What Steve Rydell pointed out, that irregardless of the nature of the columnar features, columnar joints in the center of the flow, in terms of hydrology, the centers are pretty dense and relatively impermeable. So in any one flow, his rule of thumb was that 80% of the flow is relatively impermeable. And this led to one of the general confusions about a basalt flow. In the local area, if we were to drill a domestic well down into the low, you actually might hit a little water right away at the flow top, and you'll have no water or hit a little water through fractures as you're going down, and then you hit the most water at the flow bottom. That fits what Steve Rydell says, that the flow has a dense center, and it leads to the confusion of that flow, the low flow, is considered both an aquifer because you can get water out of it, out of the saturated zones, and it's an aquitard. In other words, a layer or a portion that is almost impervious, and the aquitard prohibits easy exchange from top to bottom, prohibits easy percolation from the top to the bottom. So we have to remember that a basalt flow, any individual one, can be both one or the other. And most of our subsurface in the Moscow Pool Basin, like other areas, if you have mostly flows that are thicker than 80 feet, they're going to be primarily an aquitard, and the water is concentrated in certain zones, which we call interflow zones. So this drawing here is an attempt to illustrate 5 flows stacked on top of each other. And where's the water? Well, the most water is in the contact between the bottom part of one flow in contact with the top part of the underlying flow. So if in a sequence of 5 flows here, all equal thickness, let's just say 100 feet, but each of them having a different columnar joining in the center, the real water is still concentrated along the interflow zones. This was noticed a long time ago. I think it was Walters and Clancy, somewhere in one of their 60 reports on Whitman County, noted that if you were in Pullman drilling or throughout much of Whitman County drilling, that what you do is if you didn't have enough water when you went across the flow contactors, drill another 100 feet and you'll get more water. So I think the way they worded it was, the deeper you drill, every 100 feet, you'll add more water. So we've known for, some people have known for a long time that the aquifer system where basalts are on top of basalts is actually in a way layered, even though the lower aquifer system has interconnected similar water levels. Most of the water resources are in the fractured zones, and they are, in a way, layered or horizontally traceable. Now, what does an interflow zone look like? Here's a photograph from down on the Lewiston grade. And this contact where I'm following along the cursor here, that contact is between a very fractured, porous zone of scoria and loose basalt chunks of the flow top of the underlying Grand Ronde flow. These are Grand Ronde flows. And as you go upward, you get into the basal part of the overlying flow. This is the part which can contain water. The two zones together are referred to as an interflow zone. Now, as you go up in this overlying flow, see where they cut back the bench here. Sometimes in the field, in fact, I'd say a lot of times in the field, it's probably common for the sort of a break between the columnar configuration on the bottom and the columnar configuration on the top. And here we have this center part of the flow heading towards the top. The center part's got all these columnar joints. And I have to admit that for years, I argue with some people because I could go out there and put my hammer, my hand, my credit card in between all these what appeared to me as fractures. Excuse me again. But the reality of it is that they are opening up as a fracture because they've been what we call unloaded. You've cut the road cut, or the erosional process has exposed them to the air. When they were surrounded on all sides by basalts, they were tight. If you talk to drillers, talk to me way back in the 70s, the rule of thumb was they'd tell me, get away from that road cut and get back here 2,000 feet and drill through that same sequence. And this central part is not going to contain much water. Maybe a gallon here, 2 gallons there. You can, if you watch your gauge, when you're drilling steady, you can tell how much water is coming in sometimes. So if you're drilling steady, you would see a little tick in your air gauge if it's an air rotary rig. And I saw that many times drilling through the center of flow. And that little tick means I just hit a little gallon of water, got a little bit now. And you might even get below the water level. But the main source of water, the main source of water is going to be when you get down into this interflow zone. Let's give me a second to get some new slides up. Again, we look at a sequence of basalt flows. This is not the greatest drawing, but I think it illustrates what I'd like to show. Here again, we have 5 flows stacked on top of each other. And had we colored blue in where the water was, you would have been along these interflow zones between each flow. However, the concentration of water would have been in these darkly hatched zones where the flows are thin or where they are pinching out. What happens when a flow thins and gets below about 70 feet in thickness, the fractures on the top, the fracture part of the top joins the fractures on the bottom, and you have this unit anywhere from 50 feet down to where it pinches out that can be easily saturated, has high porosity along those fractures, and also high permeability, ability to move water from one location to another. So these zones, these pinch out zones, can be major sources for water that also can move laterally be connected to an interflow zone. Now down here on the lower right, we have a pinch out of a flow. Coming down here at the end would be where it thins, would have lots of porosity and lots of broken fractures. And that zone then could become saturated with water. If it comes in contact with clay, like many of the sediments, most of our sediments, 70% of our sediments in our subsurface of Moscow area is clay. In those areas, there would be very little or no exchange between the basalt and the clay. However, if they come in contact with the sand area, as we talked about before, where's the water? Well, in the sediments, it's in the coarse grain fraction, and that is generally the sand. Occasionally it's a conglomerate, but generally a sand. And if it flows into or is laterally connected to the sand, there's easy exchange either way, either from the basalt into the sand or the sand into the basalt. So how is this important in the Moscow area? We've looked at this diagram enough now, it's probably wearing you out. But if you look on the eastern side of this diagram, and remember it's the red areas where most of our water for the lower aquifer system comes from. Look at all of these pinch outs, all of these places where the basalt flow is thin. There's even one here, this little pink one with the cursors on right there. It's called the Grouse Creek Member. It's interesting that from the DOE Pullman test well between the two cities, you can pick up that same flow at the same elevation almost over 9 miles to the north at the Butte Gap well. Top of the elevations are within 25 feet. And when you're talking about that distance and the plus minus of collecting the sample from the driller to the lab and back, that means they're horizontal. The central part of the Moscow-Pullman Basin, between Moscow and the eastern side of Pullman, the flows, the ones that carrying most of our water, those flows are nearly horizontal. And when you examine all numerous wells, I was trying to think how many all of a sudden I can't remember, but I know we've examined over 20 wells in the central part of the basin where we don't have any deep wells with the exception of the test well. Between here and the Butte Gap well, we now have a lot of wells that have gone down 500 or 600 feet and are crossing 2 or 3, maybe even 4 intraflow contacts. When you look at those well logs in the lower aquifer, you'll find out, depending on how the driller described them, but if you look at most logs, you can see, wow, there are good, well-developed intraflow zones. If you look at a nearby well without the basalt chemistry, you can say, wow, same elevation 3 miles away, same intraflow zone. So the central part is well interconnected in intraflow zones. The eastern part of our basin, all these pinch outs. While I have one last comment, I'm going to lead into the importance of sediments. And what I want to talk about here, a lot of detail. Let's put the cursor down in one place. Let's look at, this is the U of I well 3. And we're going to talk about how well construction is important and how it can mislead you into some ideas, wrong ideas about where the water is stored. The yellow there are the sediments. The top part through the upper aquifer is required to be cased off if you are getting water from the lower aquifer, because both states, Idaho and Washington, have a law prohibiting the interchange of major aquifer systems. So the top part here in this well is cased off. The inner bed there where the cursor is at now is cased off. The inner bed here where the cursor at is cased off. Only a small portion right in the middle of this thick basalt flow, there is some openings. And then you have a screen at the bottom. The screen is, like in this case, a stainless steel screen that's welded onto the bottom of the casing that allows water in. So it cased off all the sediments except the bottom. So we got water coming in from the sediments. Then we come back to this zone right here. And it's about 125 feet of basalt. In that area, they developed, they either didn't case it or they put slots in the casing so water could come in. So we have a aquifer here that's coming from 2 types of layers. Most of it, seemed to be a lot of it, was coming from this area of the basalts. Some open hole in the flow here and a screen at the bottom. So we have a well that's producing both from the sediments and the basalts. When you look at this zone, and coming back to this area, U of I did something really unique. The maintenance area, maintenance part of the physical plant, kept samples from that well from 1950s when it was drilled to the present day. Rick Conray was, first of all, Jeff Brown back in the 70s was when we were trying to develop analytical techniques for correlation, took some samples from that well. Rick Conray from WSU 7 or 8 years back. Got samples to run his chemistry, updated chemistry on that interval. I got to look at the samples, and the important part was looking at the details of the basalt. It's very tough to get people interested in that because to them it's just black basalt chips. But if you look at the chips of this 125 zone, particularly here in the R2 in the red, it turns out there's 2 or 3 porous zones, 2 or 3 interflow contacts. So that zone of 125 feet is really either 3 different flows or 3 spread outs. Sometimes when a flow comes to an end, it doesn't stop in a 100-foot wall. It kind of spreads out, fans out in front of it. The point was there were 3 scoriaceous zones right there. And that's why most people say it's a basalt aquifer. How was that water getting to those zones? It was coming out of these sediments. The sands are delivering the water to that well, and it's just as much as a sand aquifer as it is a basalt aquifer. You may be pumping it from the basalt at that particular location, but the water storage, the water is coming from the sediments, not necessarily coming all from the basalts. It's a mixture. So this well, U of I-3, is a sediment, primarily a sediment and a basalt well. One of the reasons we don't always have good numbers is that rarely are pump tests run on the sediments. To put a screen in the sediments along through the well is very expensive, very difficult. When you drill the sediments, they come up as a mishmatch of coarse grain and fine grains. You don't know exactly where the sands are. So it's pretty practical for an engineer and the driller to case off those sediments and get the water out of the basalts because they're more stable. You can either leave them open whole, or you can put a cheap screen, or you can put slots in your casing and get the water out of the basalt easier. So that has led us over the years to believe that our aquifer system is a basalt system, and it is not. It is a basalt sediment system. One big example, I'm going to skip a slide here, and so I don't get too carried away. Let's look over into Pullman. Another example how we misunderstand the role of sediments. In Pullman, all the deep wells seem to me, past and present, seem to be stopping roughly at the same interval. Now, WSU 7 shown here in the middle. I apologize for the Grand Ronde being shown in green. We're used to red. Yellow for the sediments. In this case, we used to use blue for the low low. It's also a Grand Ronde flow. I was able to stratigraphically bring every one of the deep wells and rearrange them as if they were all horizontal. They're not horizontal. The contacts in Pullman rise and drop. Took me quite a while to get that figured out because it's a little confusing. But this particular drawing is what sedimentologists and stratigraphers sometimes use, particular stratigraphers, to look at the important areas. So what I did was I just down looking at where most of the water, where the wells stopped. To get that done, I could easily determine the last of the R2 flows. And made that a horizontal line with basalt above it. Below it, turns out, in each of the wells, underlined by a sediment. And then eventually some wells went deeper. One well went deeper. WSU was also a research well. The production zone there was in pillow lavas. And then they went deeper. WSU, the major production zone was out of sand. Clearly in WSU 8, the major production zone was out of gravels. Pullman 7, major production zone was in this interval of sediments and the underlying basalt flow. Pullman City number 8, They hit a little basalt after they started in the sand, but the major production zone, again, in a sediment zone right beneath the R2. You go to the city of Pullman, well, they cased off this clay here because there wasn't any water coming for it and drilled another 55 feet down into the basalt, open hole, and that's where their water is coming from. It's one of those wells that's only producing from one zone. But you see, that is still the same intraflow zone, in this case, separated by sediments. And it's, even though there was not water there in that clay, you got to think laterally. Pullman City 5 and Pullman City 8 are probably only a couple thousand feet apart, maybe 3. But these sediments over here in 8, between the two, is in contact with that basalt and in contact with the overlying basalt. The water is being transmitted from someplace into this intraflow zone, primarily through the sediments. These sediments consist of gravels, pillow lavas, broken up pillow lava glassy zones. What's interesting is if you look at paleo reconstructions that are published both by Idaho Geological Survey and PBAC, this zone is probably represents the Paleo Palouse River at this time in the extrusion of the basalt flows, and needs to be considered as a possible lateral source for movement of water into the Pullman area, maybe even out of the Moscow area through tributaries. What happened over time was that it was true that up here in the R2 parts of Grand Run, a lot of water was obtained, some water was obtained between intraflow zones. So most of the aquifer is considered to be a basalt aquifer. Any good driller and or supervising engineer, though, is when you finally get enough water, you stop. And they stopped in these sediments in all the major wells that have been used in the past or present time for the lower aquifer system in Pullman. Yes, they got water coming down out of some intraflow zones, but I contend the most prolific zone is where they stopped the well, where they had the most water coming in. One of the reasons we don't actually understand how much from each zone is occurring, it's very expensive to stop and run a pump test every time you hit an intraflow zone and determine how much water is coming in. You generally wait till your system's overwhelmed, your hammer tool is flooded, you're looking at the water coming out of the well, and you've now added up to 2,000 or 3,000 gallons a minute, and you stop. Then you run a pump test to determine what kind of pump to put in, but you really don't know how much water come out of each of the zones, except where you stop is generally you've either added up to enough water or the last zone was your most productive. And so therefore, the point is that I overmake is that the Pullman aquifer system is not just basalts, it's being fed by sediments, and they play an important role in that system. And it's important because I believe most modelers, most people trying to determine, come up with a number how much water we have, has overlooked this rule, particularly in Moscow and Pullman. I was alerted to this by a man named, his last name is Light, L-I-T-E, 2013 article in a Basalt Symposium volume. The last article in 400 pages was about groundwater systems. And he worked over in Oregon, south of the Columbia River. And he starts off by saying, we have overlooked the role of sediments in Columbia River basalts. And they got me thinking, even though I'd thought about the sediments before and was somewhat irritated that people kept calling it a basalt aquifer, I got more interested and broke down and started looking at our aquifer and came to that same conclusion that our modelers are overlooking the importance of the sediments. One last basic or general rule of thumb, going back to our diagram here. People will always ask them questions about the deep part of the aquifer. It's got some sediment layers in it. We only have the one test well, the report by Ralston Hydrological Services, I believe. I know Dale Ralston wrote the report. He uses the term that these aquifer systems, or these aquifer units in the subsurface below the what's now called the R2 were not nearly as prolific as those in the upper. So, and since most of it is interconnected to the upper anyways, drilling that deep to get the water doesn't mean we have new resources down there. It's interconnected to our top aquifer. And the cost of drilling down that deep is expensive. Another piece of information, and I think it was used by the last modeler on the basin, is that there has been several numerical models which indicate that once you get below 1,000 feet, 1,200 feet, that the fractures close and that the permeability and porosity and aquifer productivity decreases with depth after that. And of course, we're already down these wells here in Pullman range from 700 feet to about 900 feet. So that was the Madra kind of for this lower parts, not necessarily a great aquifer system to drill for, and it's definitely not a new resource. Now, I will say that maybe that rule of thumb isn't consistent across the whole plateau. Talking to Dale Ralston here recently on just a short discussion we had on, he's supervising pump tests in Lewiston, and he says that they're down 2,000 feet, and the interflow zones there are producing a lot of water, and they seem to be controlled from one place to another. In Lewiston, those areas are gently folded, not folded quite as much as Moscow and Pullman, and maybe they're nicely interconnected. Whatever, it's a little confusing, but it doesn't matter. There's no new resources down there. And since it doesn't have the same aquifer, prolific aquifers, it's not like, well, we have 2,000 feet of water because, or 1,200 feet of water because from our water level down to the bottom of the well is all the same. I mean, so we have 1,200 years ago. No, it doesn't work that way. These lower areas are not that productive. One more topic to cover in terms of basics is what I call structures. I'm going to throw out some terminology, but really this is kind of an introduction to the next talk. The next lecture is on structural features in the Palouse Basin system. And the kind of things we'll talk about is first folds. Folds is where the rocks get bent. We have names, anticline for upfolds, incline for a downfold. A monocline is where you go from gentle horizontal beds and they change their dip. Folds have been shown by research since the 1950s that when groundwater comes across the fold, it can do a couple things. Obviously, you've bent the intraflow zones, so some of these structural features have been shown to be impediments. In other words, if you go into the center anticline here, what happens is because fractures have been compressed, that fold can become a barrier to lateral movement. Not necessarily always a complete barrier, but it can be a partial barrier. The same thing with a monocline and a syncline. Now, we're going to talk about these in more detail in the next lecture. Just introducing them here. If they're familiar old-time terms to you, you're ready to go. If they're confusing, get into the Google, plug in folds and faults, and you got several pages of block diagrams, outcrops, and so forth, telling you what folds are like. We also have to consider structural features. Another structural feature are faults. Faults down here shown on the bottom unit. Here's a faulted unit. It displaces the inner flow zones. Sometimes it does grind out the rocks so much that the fault can become a conduit for lateral movement. We talk about tilted units. This is probably the most important in the Palouse Basin. When you have tilted units, it's going to interfere with the way the water flows. And a quick illustration here, I'll come up with this one. What happens when you tilt the intraflow zones? Well, basic engineering is water moves downhill. So you tilt the interflow zones in any way, the water is going to move down the dip. Rydell points that out in his summary of gas storage potential in western Washington. The water moves down what he would call dip, which is a geology term. It can downslope, whatever you want to call it. Water moves downhill and it moves down the dip of basalt units. So we're going to look at some of those in the Moscow-Pullman Basin and the Palouse Basin next time. Just remember this, here's some tilted units. This area up here would be, if you run on a stream across it, that's the area that might be exposed to some recharge, but water is going to try to move down those contacts. Low angle tilts, some people believe that our tilting rocks in the western part of our basin are too gentle. I contend it doesn't, as long as they're tilted, the water is going to try to flow down those contacts. And when you have low angle tilts, you have more exposure of the basalt flow than you do, and more exposure of your interflow zones than you do when they're steeply tilted. Steeply tilted. Look down here, another structural feature. It's not really a structure feature, but we tend to include it. We have some dikes, identified dikes in the western Palouse Basin. And dikes crisscross or cross-cut interflow zones, and therefore they can become a barrier to lateral flow. So once again, the important part is the water flows downhill. And let's just take a look at just one example. We'll get some more examples next time. Are our rocks folded or bent or tilted in the subsurface? This is one cross-section. The green is the Grand Ronde. The blue up here is our old favorite on top, the low flow. And if we go from downtown Pullman City Well 7 is about where the old train station is. It's about where the intersection where you turn up the hill to go up to the Hilltop Restaurant, heading towards Colfax. Those contacts, this drawing is magnified so we can see them. They're not quite this steep. But those contacts verified by basalt chemistry. And in this case, these units become exposed in the outcrops, and I've walked them as they rise above the DOE city yard wells, and you can trace them into the lower ones in the DOE city yard wells. They rise a little over 100 feet and less than 1,500 feet. So they're rising towards where the municipal buildings are. And then they can be traced to drop, to gently drop. This is a small upfold with a western gentle dip going out into the Union Flat Creek area. And you can pick up those same contacts in the DOE landfill well 4 miles to the west. It is a little bit of a kick to the northwest, so you are going at oblique angles, but the contacts are 200 feet below those over 4 miles. It's been proven that the rocks are folded. The basalts dip to the west, slope to the west. And one thing we're going to talk about, we talked about pinch outs. Look at it right here. As that water is going down that Grand Ronde contact, it comes across the Rosa flow where it's been pinched and thinning out. Now, in research where the South Fork of the Palouse by a student named Moxley has showed that the water is flowing across the South Fork down the slope of the dipping inner flow zones into the contact between the Rosa flow and the Grand Ronde. So that's sort of the introduction to the next talk. Let's hang on a second. I'm just about done here. If we plot, where are the major folds? Well, what we call a syncline. There's one here from Pullman to Albion. There's an anticline, which has been documented many times now, that goes from the granitic rocks to the south, crosses through, right through the western end of Pullman. The hilltop restaurant is just about at the apex of that fold, and drop down in elevation to Albion. There's a syncline been mapped since the 1970s. It goes right down the Union Flat Creek, and Union Flat Creek's direction of flow is probably controlled by that syncline, so I suspect the groundwater moves that direction. And then lastly, of importance to our Palouse Basin, out here to the southwest along the Snake River, we have an anticline. There's documentation that the water is moving away from that anticline down into the syncline area. It's not moving out and coming out of exposed aquifer rocks that are in the same sequence as Pullman. There's not any water coming, or very little water coming out of those springs on that those slopes of the Snake River. Water is flowing, in this case, down into the Union Flat Creek area, away from the Snake River. All of these are northwest trending structures, and we're going to talk about them and their potential for being a barrier and for definitely deflecting water movements. So let's see if I probably didn't emphasize these enough, but the basalt basin is very complex. It's not one hydrological unit. It's several geologic units, several complexities between the basalts and the sediments. The basalts are not always the same from location to location. The Palouse Basin then becomes unique in its location of thick sequences next to a high elevation mountain with high snowfall, high rainfall. And in order to understand it, you have to put together these unique features and its complex natures into bringing in some basic principles, rules of thumb from other areas throughout the Columbia Plateau. Needs to be incorporated to understand how the whole system works. Thank you for your time and attention. The next talk is on the general structural features of the Palouse Basin. Thank you.